He thought she didn't understand a single word, but in a room built on power, silence can be the most dangerous language of all. The chandelier lights spilled across polished marble floors, catching the edges of crystal glasses and gold-rimmed plates as laughter drifted through Vincent Castellano's private dining hall, a place where every chair cost more than most people's monthly rent, and every guest knew exactly who held control. At the far end of the table, Amara Johnson moved quietly between shadows and light, her posture straight, her expression neutral, the kind of invisibility that came not from absence, but from being deliberately overlooked, her dark uniform blending into the background as if she were part of the architecture itself. Vincent watched her the way one might watch a detail in a painting, present, but insignificant, his fingers tapping once against the stem of his glass before he spoke, his voice smooth, deliberate, switching effortlessly into Italian, a language none of his guests questioned, issuing a command just loud enough to draw attention without breaking the rhythm of conversation. A few heads turned, a few smiles curved with curiosity, because tone alone carried meaning, and the tone was unmistakable, dismissive, amused, designed to place someone beneath notice. Amara paused for half a second, not enough for anyone to accuse her of hesitation, just enough to register the weight of the moment as the guests leaned in slightly, sensing something unsaid but understood, the subtle shift in atmosphere that happens when a room decides to watch. Vincent repeated himself, slower. This time, his words crisp, precise, layered with a kind of theatrical patience, as if he were performing for an audience rather than speaking to a person, and a ripple of quiet laughter followed, the kind that stays just polite enough to deny cruelty while still carrying its edge. One woman lifted her phone just a fraction, not openly recording, just ready, just in case something worth remembering happened. Amara stepped forward, her movements measured, her hands steady as she reached the table, the faint reflection of light catching in her eyes. But there was no tremble, no visible discomfort, nothing that matched the expectation building around her. Vincent leaned back slightly, observing, waiting for the misunderstanding to reveal itself, for the confusion, the awkward correction, the moment that would confirm the hierarchy everyone in the room already believed in. Instead, there was only stillness, a quiet that stretched just long enough to become noticeable, the kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats without knowing why. Amara's gaze lifted, not defiant, not submissive, simply direct, and for the first time that evening, Vincent's attention sharpened, something in that calm disrupting the easy certainty he had carried into the moment. The laughter faded, replaced by a thin, uncertain quiet, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether the story unfolding would follow the script everyone expected or something else entirely, something no one had planned for, something that would not be undone once spoken. Vincent did not speak immediately, and that was what unsettled the room more than anything else, because a man like him was never without words, never without control. Yet now he simply watched her, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if recalculating something he had already decided. The guests shifted in their seats, their earlier amusement fading into a thin, uncertain curiosity, because the expected reaction had not arrived, and expectation, once broken, leaves a kind of quiet discomfort that no one wants to name. Amara stood there with the tray balanced lightly in her hands, the soft clink of glass against porcelain the only sound that dared to exist between them, and even that seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the room itself had grown sensitive to every detail. Vincent finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze fixed on her with a sharper edge now, and he repeated the command again in the same foreign language, slower, clearer, each word placed with intention, not just to be understood, but to test, to push, to confirm what he believed was true. A man at the far end let out a short laugh, quickly stifled when no one joined him, and the woman, with the phone lowered it slightly, her expression tightening, unsure whether this was still entertainment or something else entirely. Amara's fingers tightened just enough against the tray to leave a faint imprint, a small detail that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here it became part of the silence, part of the tension that stretched across the room like a wire pulled too tight. Vincent's voice softened on the final repetition, not kinder, but colder, the way a person speaks when they expect obedience without question, when they are certain of their position and the world that supports it. The air seemed heavier now, the warm glow of the chandelier no longer comforting but exposing, revealing every glance, every hesitation, every shift in posture as the guests realized they were no longer just observers, but witnesses to something they did not fully understand. Amara inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that centers rather than steadies, and for a brief second, her gaze drifted past Vincent, not in avoidance, but as if measuring the entire room, taking in the faces, the polished surfaces, the quiet arrogance that lived in spaces like this. And then she looked back at him, directly, fully, without lowering her eyes. The stillness deepened, becoming almost tangible, and Vincent felt it before he acknowledged it. That subtle shift where control begins to slip not through action, but through the absence of expected reaction. He tilted his head slightly, studying her, and for the first time since the evening began, there was a flicker of something unfamiliar behind his composure. Not doubt exactly, but the awareness that something was about to happen that he had not scripted. And in that suspended moment, before a single word was spoken, the balance in the room began to move, quietly, almost invisibly, but undeniably, like a tide turning before anyone on the shore realizes the water has already changed direction. Then she spoke, and the language Vincent had used as a barrier became a mirror instead, her voice calm, clear, and unmistakably fluent, each word placed with a precision that carried not just understanding but quiet authority. And for a fraction of a second no one in the room moved because the sound did not match the image they had already decided was true. The cadence was natural, effortless, not rehearsed or hesitant, but lived in, as if it belonged to her long before this room ever existed. And what she said was not loud, not confrontational, yet it cut through the atmosphere with a clarity that demanded attention, correcting his phrasing with a subtle shift, refining his intent without raising her tone, as though she were adjusting a detail rather than challenging a man. Vincent did not react immediately, but his fingers stilled against the table, the smallest interruption in his composed exterior, and that was enough for the room to feel it, that shift from certainty to awareness, from control to observation. A guest near the center leaned forward slightly, brows drawn together, trying to follow the exchange now that it had moved beyond what they could casually dismiss, while the woman with the phone lowered it completely, no longer interested in capturing a moment that suddenly felt too real to reduce to a recording. Amara continued, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, translating not only his words but the implication behind them, removing the edge he had placed there with a quiet, deliberate choice of phrasing that returned dignity to the command without ever stating that it had been taken away. And that was when the realization began to settle across the table, slow but undeniable, that she had understood him from the very beginning, that every word, every tone, every intention had been heard and measured before she ever chose to respond. Vincent leaned back slightly, studying her now with a focus that had nothing to do with dismissal and everything to do with recognition, the kind that comes when a detail you overlooked refuses to stay small. And for the first time that evening he was not performing for his guests. He was listening. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer built on expectation but on recalibration, as if the entire room had to adjust its understanding of what it was seeing. And in that recalibration, the balance shifted further, not dramatically, not with any visible force, but with the quiet inevitability of something true replacing something assumed. Amara finished speaking and allowed the last word to settle, without adding anything more. No explanation, no apology, no need to prove what had already been demonstrated, and she simply stood there, composed, present, no longer invisible in the way she had been moments ago. Vincent's eyes held hers for a second longer than necessary, not out of challenge, but out of something closer to curiosity, and in that brief exchange the room understood what he had not yet said aloud, that whatever role they had assigned her had just been rewritten, and not by him. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the kind of shift that had just occurred did not allow for quick recovery, and the room, once filled with controlled laughter and quiet superiority, now held something heavier, something that pressed gently against every person seated at that table. Vincent remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Amara, not with irritation or offense, but with a level of attention that stripped away the performance he had maintained all evening, as if he were seeing her for the first time without the filter of assumption. A man seated to his right cleared his throat softly, attempting to restart the flow of conversation, but the sound fell flat, unanswered, because no one wanted to be the first to pretend nothing had changed. Amara did not move to fill the silence, did not retreat or apologize. She simply stood there with the same quiet composure, allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was, unsoftened, uncorrected. Vincent exhaled, slowly, almost imperceptibly, then leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a release of something that had been held too tightly. And when he finally spoke again, he did not return to the foreign language. He spoke in clear, measured English, his voice carrying across the table without force, without theatrics. He asked her a question, simple on the surface, but layered with something deeper, not what she had done, but how long she had known, how long she had understood everything that had been said around her without ever revealing it. A few guests exchanged glances, the curiosity now fully replacing the earlier amusement, because this was no longer about a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was about revelation, about the quiet exposure of a truth that had been present all along. Amara answered without hesitation, her tone even, respectful but not diminished, explaining in a few precise words that she had learned the language years ago, that it had been part of a life that looked very different from the one she stood in now. And she did not elaborate beyond that. She did not offer details that would invite sympathy or admiration. She simply stated the fact and allowed it to stand on its own. Vincent's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough for those watching closely to notice, the faintest hint of something like acknowledgement passing through his eyes, the recognition of restraint, of choice, because understanding something and choosing silence are not the same, and he knew that. One of the guests, a woman in a tailored cream dress, leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now, asking a question that carried none of the earlier edge, but instead a careful curiosity, as if she were adjusting her own perception in real time. And Amara responded to her as well, briefly, politely, never stepping beyond the space she occupied yet no longer confined by it. The energy in the room had transformed completely, not through confrontation, not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through a single moment of clarity that could not be undone. And Vincent, who had built his world on control and precision, understood something in that instant that none of his carefully chosen words could have taught him. That power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, silent, patient, until the exact moment it chooses to be seen. And when it does, there is nothing left to argue against. The conversation did not return to what it had been, no matter how much the guests attempted to guide it back, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. And once people become aware of their own assumptions, even the smallest interaction begins to feel different. Vincent reached for his glass, but instead of lifting it immediately, his fingers paused along the rim, tracing its edge as his attention remained on Amara, who had now taken a small step back from the table, not retreating, but repositioning herself with quiet intention, as if she understood that her presence no longer needed to demand space in order to be recognized. The soft murmur of voices slowly returned, cautious at first, then building as individuals tried to reclaim their sense of normalcy. Yet every glance that drifted toward her carried a different weight now, no longer dismissive, but searching, as though they were attempting to reconcile the image they had constructed with the reality that had just been revealed. Vincent finally lifted his glass, took a measured sip, and set it down with deliberate calm, the sound of crystal touching marble echoing just slightly louder than expected in the still, fragile atmosphere. And when he spoke again, it was not to entertain his guests, not to reassert dominance, but to address her directly, his tone steady, controlled, yet stripped of the earlier edge that had invited amusement at her expense. He asked her where she had learned not just the language, but the precision behind it, the kind of understanding that went beyond vocabulary and into nuance, into structure, into the quiet corrections she had made without drawing attention to them. And the question itself carried a shift in weight, because it was no longer testing, it was acknowledging. Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, and for a moment it seemed as though she might remain silent again, not out of fear, but out of choice, as if she were deciding how much of herself to allow into a room that had not earned it. And when she finally answered, her voice remained even, composed, revealing just enough to satisfy the question without surrendering control of her story, mentioning years spent studying, working, moving through spaces where language was not decoration but necessity, where precision mattered because misunderstanding carried consequences that extended far beyond embarrassment. A quiet recognition passed through Vincent's expression, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that does not announce itself but settles in the eyes, reshaping the way he saw her, and perhaps more importantly, the way he saw his own earlier certainty. One of the men at the table shifted in his seat, attempting a light remark to ease the tension, but the humor fell flat, because no one in the room was willing to reduce the moment back to something trivial, not after what had just been revealed. Amara adjusted the tray in her hands and turned slightly, prepared to continue her work, yet there was no urgency in her movement, no need to escape the space, because she was no longer navigating it as someone invisible, and Vincent watched that movement with a focus that lingered a fraction longer than before, not possessive, not intrusive, but contemplative, as if he were considering not what she had done, but what it meant that she had chosen to do it in that exact moment, in that exact way. And as the room slowly resumed its rhythm, it did so under a new understanding, one that could not be undone, that power, when real, does not need to raise its voice, and that dignity, once revealed, reshapes every silence that follows. By the time the main course was served, the room had regained its structure but not its certainty, and that difference lingered in every exchanged glance and measured word, as if the evening had been quietly rewritten without anyone formally acknowledging it. Amara moved through the space with the same steady rhythm, placing plates, adjusting settings, refilling glasses, yet the way people looked at her had changed in subtle but undeniable ways, no longer through her, but at her, as though they were trying to understand something they had missed before. Vincent noticed it all, not because he was searching for it, but because he was no longer able to ignore it, his attention returning to her in small, unplanned moments, the way her hands moved with precision, the way she anticipated needs without being instructed, the way she spoke only when necessary, and when she did, it carried clarity without excess. He found himself replaying the earlier exchange, not the words themselves, but the restraint behind them, the deliberate timing, the choice to remain silent until silence itself became the statement. And that realization unsettled him in a way he did not outwardly show, because it suggested something he had not accounted for, that control could exist without display, that authority could be exercised without permission. Across the table, one of the guests attempted to draw him back into conversation, asking about a recent business matter, but Vincent's response, though accurate, lacked the performative ease he had maintained earlier. His focus divided in a way that was new, unfamiliar, as if part of his attention had shifted to something that did not fit neatly into the world he was used to managing. Amara approached again, this time to clear a setting, and for a brief moment their proximity carried a different weight, not tension, not discomfort, but awareness, the kind that does not need to be acknowledged to exist. Vincent spoke again, not loudly, not for the room, but for her, asking a question that did not belong to the performance of the evening, something quieter, more personal, not about language, not about skill, but about choice, why she had chosen to remain silent for as long as she had when she clearly did not need to. The question lingered between them, simple in form yet layered in implication, and for a second Amara paused, not because she lacked an answer, but because she seemed to consider whether the answer was owed. When she responded, her voice remained calm, unguarded but not exposed, explaining that not every room is meant to hear everything you know, that sometimes understanding is not something you offer freely, but something you hold until it matters. And the words settled with a quiet weight that extended beyond their exchange, touching something in the space that could not be easily dismissed. Vincent did not respond immediately, and that silence, once again, became part of the conversation, not empty, but full, carrying recognition, perhaps even a trace of respect that had not been present before. Around them, the evening continued, conversations resumed, glasses were lifted, but beneath it all, something had shifted permanently, a recalibration that would not reverse itself by morning. Because once a person is seen differently, truly seen, there is no returning to the version that existed before, and Vincent, who had built his world on knowing exactly where everyone stood, now found himself facing a truth he had not anticipated. That sometimes the person you overlook is the one who understands the room more completely than anyone else. In it, the dessert course arrived with a softness that contrasted the tension still woven into the room. Delicate plates placed with careful precision, the scent of caramel and warm pastry drifting through the air, yet no one reacted with the same ease as before, because something unspoken continued to shape the space, something that had nothing to do with food or conversation and everything to do with perception. Amara moved between the guests with the same quiet efficiency, but now there was a distance around her, not isolation, but a respectful space that people unconsciously gave when they realized they had misjudged someone. A subtle recalibration that no one openly admitted, yet everyone followed. Vincent observed it without turning his head, his awareness extending beyond direct sight, the way it always had, but now tuned to a different frequency, one that picked up on details he had once dismissed as irrelevant. And as he watched her place a dessert plate before him, his gaze lingered not on the action itself, but on the intention behind it, the deliberate calm, the absence of hesitation, the quiet assurance that did not seek approval. He spoke again, his voice lower this time, carrying only as far as necessary, asking her one more question, not about her past, not about her knowledge, but about her decision in that exact moment earlier. Why she had chosen to respond the way she did instead of continuing to remain silent. And the question held no accusation, only genuine curiosity, as if he were trying to understand a language that did not follow the rules he was used to. Amara paused just briefly, setting the final plate down with steady hands before meeting his gaze again, and when she answered, her words were simple, almost understated, yet they carried a clarity that settled deeper than anything spoken that evening. She said that silence has value, but only when it is chosen, not when it is expected, and that there is a difference between being unseen and allowing yourself to disappear. The words did not echo, they did not demand attention, but they remained, suspended in the air between them, impossible to ignore once heard. Vincent leaned back, slightly, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then something shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be declared, and he nodded once, a small gesture, yet in a room like this, from a man like him, it carried weight far beyond its size. Around them, the conversations continued, but they no longer defined the evening. They filled space rather than controlled it, because the center had moved, no longer anchored in performance or status, but in something far more subtle, something that had revealed itself without force. Amara stepped away from the table, continuing her work, but she did not return to invisibility, not in the way she had before, because once a presence is recognized, it does not fade simply because the moment passes, and Vincent watched her for a second longer than necessary, not as a distraction, not as an interruption, but as a consideration, a shift in perspective that would not easily reverse. And in that quiet, unspoken exchange, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the steady certainty of truth, that respect, once earned in silence, cannot be taken back by noise. The evening began to dissolve into its final moments, but unlike most gatherings in rooms like this, where the end comes with louder voices and loosened restraint, this one quieted instead, as if the space itself had decided to hold on to what had been revealed rather than let it fade into routine. Plates were cleared, chairs shifted slightly, and the soft clinking of glass returned, yet every movement carried a new awareness, a subtle hesitation that had not been there before, because once people recognize dignity where they had expected none, it becomes difficult to move carelessly again. Amara continued her work with the same composed rhythm, but she was no longer navigating the room as someone who needed to remain unnoticed. There was a quiet certainty in her presence now, not something displayed, but something understood, and the guests responded to it instinctively, offering small nods, brief acknowledgments, gestures that would have been unnecessary earlier but now felt almost required. Vincent remained seated for longer than anyone expected, his usual pattern of closing an evening interrupted by something less predictable, his gaze occasionally lifting toward her, not with scrutiny, but with consideration, as though he were tracing the outline of a realization that had not fully settled yet. One of his closest associates leaned in, speaking quietly, attempting to redirect his attention back to familiar matters, schedules, decisions, the mechanics of control that had always defined his world. But Vincent's response was measured, delayed, as if he were operating within two conversations at once, one spoken, one internal. When Amara approached to collect his final glass, there was no pause this time, no tension, only a brief exchange of eye contact that carried more meaning than any extended dialogue could have. And Vincent did something that did not go unnoticed, not by the guests, not by the staff, not even by himself. He thanked her, simply, directly, without embellishment, without performance. The words placed with the same precision she had used earlier, and in that moment the weight of the evening found its quiet resolution. No one commented, no one reacted outwardly, but the silence that followed was different from all the others, not uncertain, not heavy, but settled, as if the room had reached an understanding it did not need to explain. Amara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without diminishing them, then turned to continue her work, her steps steady, unhurried, unchanged in appearance yet entirely different in meaning. Vincent watched her walk away for a fraction longer than necessary, then finally rose from his seat, signaling the end of the evening without needing to announce it. And as the guests began to gather themselves, there was a noticeable shift in how they carried themselves, a subtle recalibration of tone, of posture, of the way they spoke to those they might have overlooked before. The room, still filled with light and quiet luxury, no longer felt like a stage for power, but something more balanced, more aware, shaped not by dominance, but by the recognition of something that could not be taken, only acknowledged. And as the doors opened and the night outside waited in stillness, one truth lingered behind them, unspoken yet undeniable, that sometimes the strongest presence in the room is the one that never needed to prove it. The doors closed behind the last guest with a soft, final click, and the mansion settled into a different kind of silence, one that no longer carried tension but reflection, the kind that lingers after something meaningful has occurred without announcement. The staff moved quietly through the room, clearing the final remnants of the evening, folding linen, gathering glassware, restoring the polished perfection that defined spaces like this. Yet even in their routine, there was a subtle shift, a shared awareness that something had unfolded that would not be undone by simply resetting the table. Amara worked with the same steady rhythm, placing each item exactly where it belonged, her movements unchanged, but the atmosphere around her no longer treated her as background. Even in the absence of guests, there was a recognition that remained, quiet but present, like a note that continues to resonate after the sound itself has faded. Vincent did not leave immediately, which in itself was unusual. He stood near the far end of the room, his jacket draped over his arm, watching the final stages of an evening that had not followed any of his expectations, his mind moving through details not as a strategist calculating outcomes, but as someone reconsidering assumptions that had once felt fixed. He approached slowly, not with urgency, not with authority, but with intention, stopping just short of where Amara was placing the last glass into its case. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not out of discomfort, but because the silence between them no longer needed to be filled to hold meaning. Vincent finally broke it, his voice even, controlled, but carrying none of the distance it had at the beginning of the night. And he acknowledged something without framing it as a question or a command. He said that not many people would have chosen to respond the way she did, that most would have either stayed silent or reacted emotionally, and that what she had done required something different, something measured. Amara listened without interrupting, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, and when she answered, her voice held the same calm certainty that had defined every word she had spoken that evening. She said that dignity does not ask for permission, it waits, and when the moment is right, It simply exists in a way that cannot be ignored. Vincent absorbed the words without immediate reply, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and, for the first time, there was no need for him to assert anything in return, no need to shape the outcome of the interaction, because the outcome had already been decided the moment she chose to speak. He gave a small nod, not as a conclusion, but as recognition, then turned to leave, his steps measured, his posture unchanged. Yet something in the way he carried himself suggested that the evening had altered more than just a single moment. Amara watched him go for a brief second before returning to her work, not because she needed to retreat, but because her role, her presence, her identity had never depended on the way others perceived her, only on the way she chose to stand within herself. The lights dimmed slightly as the final preparations for the night were completed, and the room, once filled with layered voices and quiet judgments, now rested in a calm that felt earned rather than imposed. And in that stillness, there was no applause, no dramatic resolution, only the quiet understanding that something had been corrected without force, that a truth had surfaced without being announced, and that from that point forward, anyone who had been in that room would remember not what was said first, but what was finally understood. And that day, without a single raised voice, the room learned what dignity looks like.